So now that we've gone over all of Lucas's Star Wars creations and his involvement in the EU, while I think we've hit a lot of it, there are still some smaller claims I've seen people bring up in this regard that I want to address that didn't necessarily have a place elsewhere. I'll try to address as many as I've seen, but if I miss something that you want answered or you want me to comment on, feel free to leave it in the comment section and I'll try to answer the best I can. The first miscellaneous kind of rebuttal I want to bring up, it's something I know I'm going to see from angry commenters. I just kind of want to get it out of the way. It's this idea that Disney Star Wars is worse than the EU, so why are you defending it? Take the EU over that. Okay, well, first off, whether one thinks Disney canon is better or worse, that's subjective and that's irrelevant. We're talking about George Lucas and the EU. Disney is irrelevant to that. Disney has nothing to do with that. This is a discussion just about George and the EU. But maybe along those same lines, I've also seen some people say, okay, well, the Clone Wars multimedia project is better than TCW. Again, that's a subjective take, but either way, it's irrelevant. We're talking about what Lucas considered canon. Writing quality is irrelevant to that. The writing quality of the prequels is still something debated today, but that has no bearing on the fact that Lucas considered them canon. Many may say the novelizations of the prequels are better than the films themselves, but obviously the story Lucas accepts is what's in the film and not the book. So it doesn't matter if you think Clone Wars Multimedia Project is better, it's a discussion on canonicity, not writing quality. So let's talk about some George Lucas quotes that seem to support the idea of George Lucas counting the EU as canon. I intentionally left these for the end because having the additional information I presented would be helpful in responding to these. So the first one is the infamous Starlog quote that everyone talks about. The I don't read that stuff, I haven't read any of the novels, etc. I don't know anything about that world. That's a different world than my world. But I do try to keep it consistent. The way I do it now is that they have a Star Wars encyclopedia. So if I come up with a name or something else, I look it up and see if it's already been used. When I said other people could make their own Star Wars stories, we decided that, like Star Trek, we would have two universes, my universe and then this other one. They try to make their universe as consistent with mine as possible, but obviously they get enthusiastic and want to go off in other directions. So, of course, the EU purists, and I deal with them all the time, they'll say this quote's been debunked, it's irrelevant, you can't use it, whatever. Okay, so first things first, I've seen some people bring up the fact that George said he tries to keep it consistent, and why would he do that if he doesn't see it as canon? Well, maybe because he didn't want to be a jerk. If you really think he wanted to keep it 100% consistent, I'll just simply say two words that prove otherwise. Boba Fett. I've seen some EU purists like the YouTube channel Captain Fordo in his 93-minute video on the expanded universe try to tackle this one by saying parallel universes are something that go the same direction working towards the same end. I've seen other channels such as Star Wars Scran employ the same kind of idea. While I admire the effort, I think it needs to be kept in mind what parallel means. They don't intersect. They remain a constant distance apart and never meet, which is why, even though it wasn't a perfect analogy, George used the term parallel, because two parallel lines are, and always will be, separate from each other, and his Star Wars vision is not the same as the EU's. A lot of purists like to bring up Leland Cheese quote addressing this. George Lucas is certainly not bound by the EU, though he's certainly open to using things created in it. Aayla Secura and the Coruscant name, for example. On the other hand, the quote you provide makes it sound like the EU is separate from George's vision of the Star Wars universe. It is not. The EU must follow certain tenets set by George through the films and other guidelines that he provides outside of the films. Parallel universe suggests that each universe can go in separate directions, which really isn't the case with regard to the EU. The EU is bound by what is seen in the most current version of the films and by directives from George Lucas. He also said in 2009, the Holocron Keeper does not support the notion of Star Wars parallel universes. First off, as I said, it wasn't a perfect analogy. Lucas was using it to communicate the point that they remain separate from each other. While parallel universes aren't necessarily dependent on each other's events, the way the EU was designed, it must correlate with George Lucas's Star Wars. George's Star Wars was not required to be impacted by the EU. Maybe think of it more as a branched timeline than that turns into a parallel universe. The events of George's Star Wars must have happened in both universes, but the events of the EU sources only need to happen in the EU universe. There's a reason the EU was designed this way, and we'll address it at the end of the video. Also, isn't it interesting to note that he simply says the EU can't go in its own direction, but he never says George can't either? In fact, he says George is not bound by the EU, implying he can go in a separate direction. But if they're the same, then neither could go in a separate direction. This is some really good insight. Second off, like I've mentioned, purists will try to claim parallel didn't really mean separate like we might think. As I've said before, George Lucas knows science fiction. Parallel universe generally means something separate, not two parts of the same whole. And even if he really did mean they were the same continuity, and parallel was just an expression people misinterpret, then why would Chi feel the need to address it and downplay the use of the word parallel? If it really didn't mean anything separate, he would have simply said, yeah, parallel, what's wrong with that? As opposed to saying, well, gee, I don't know, parallel doesn't mean alternate. Come on, guys. Third off, why would we trust Leland Chi's interpretation of George's words over George's words themselves on the topic of what George thought? That one always confused me. Even then, why would we trust Leland Chi when Leland Chi admitted Dave Filoni would know George's thoughts better than he would? He said, I did not have direct contact with George about Star Wars continuity. Dave Filoni, who worked on Clone Wars, definitely did. Leland even admitted this was merely his own personal interpretation of canon and that it is at odds with Lucas. He literally said, the Holocron Keeper does not support the notion of the parallel universe. He's not saying George doesn't, because George clearly does. He's saying he doesn't. He is in Chi, Leland Chi. Whose words do we take as more important? He says here, the dual universe question comes up often. I know George has mentioned it being two universes, but that's not how I see it. His vision is definitely not beholden to ours, but ours is definitely beholden to his. Just as I explained a minute ago, George mentioned it being two universes, but Leland isn't saying that's not actually what George meant. Leland is saying, well, no, I disagree with George, even though we're talking about George's interpretation of the EU's canonicity, and the EU purists will take Leland's words to try and refute that, even though Leland just admitted here in 2012, not, after the Disney buyout, before that actually, no, this is his interpretation. It's not George's. He also admitted this. You're asking the keeper of the holocron, so of course I'm going to be a bit biased. The reality is that a huge number of people who have seen all 6 Star Wars films have never played a Star Wars game, visited a Star Wars website, watched a Star Wars television program, read a Star Wars publication, or purchased a Star Wars action figure or collectible. It would be a great disservice to discount these people as fans. So again, take that, anyone who says you're a fake fan unless you love the EU. Leland clearly was just trying to do damage control here. He's clearly expressed it's his own interpretation of canon and not anything from Lucas. And we've already shown other quotes from Leland Chi previously in the video that kind of go along with this. Now, in a debate about how Lucas licensing treats the canonicity of the EU, I'll happily take Leland's words over George in most instances. However, this is a debate on George's thoughts on the EU. So again, why on earth would we take Leland's confessed biased take over George's words at face value? Anyone who's willing to be intellectually honest about this discussion regarding the Starlog quote must be willing to admit that this logic commonly used to apparently rebuke this sounds absurd. Now, let's talk about the splinter of the mind's eye quote. After Star Wars was released, it became apparent that my story, however many films it took to tell, was only one of thousands that could be told about the characters who inhabit its galaxy. But these were not stories that I was destined to tell. Instead, they would spring from the imagination of other writers, inspired by the glimpse of a galaxy that Star Wars provided. Today, it is an amazing, if unexpected, legacy of Star Wars that so many gifted writers are contributing new stories to the saga. I'll be honest, this is a good piece of evidence from the EU purists. And if this was our only quote from Lucas on the matter, or if it was just this and the Starlog quote, and George stopped making Star Wars after Revenge of the Sith and didn't dabble with TCW or the sequel treatments, I would probably be willing to concede the argument, and I probably wouldn't even be putting this all together. Problem is, when you look at George's comments over the years, this seems to be an outlier. And the majority of the evidence, quotes from George, quotes from Lucasfilm Associates, and his work on the prequel trilogy, the Clone Wars, and the sequel trilogy, seems to support the conclusion that he didn't count it as canon. Why would he say this? I could say he simply must have changed his mind, but there are statements from Lucasfilm Associates that imply otherwise that were before this, so that timeline would not add up. My best guess? It's a marketing tactic, and we'll address this more in a bit. Sure, a purist could ignore everything else I've said and take this quote alone and run with it. And I'm not saying all 100% of the evidence supports my conclusion. I just think it supports an overwhelming majority of it. But if the EU purist wants to take this and say my argument isn't 100% supported by the facts, well, neither is theirs, and at best for them, if they want to claim this quote really means George was saying the EU is canon to him, well, then in light of everything else, their narrative that George held the EU as canon is no longer the definitive truth and simply becomes a theory that they can no longer claim is the definitive truth, but just a conclusion they reached based off of some of the evidence. So don't take my concession on this point alone as proof the EU purist narrative is right. And while I'm just admitted that 100% of the facts don't support me, that doesn't mean I'm being dishonest or that I'm wrong. I'm simply arguing the case that best supports a majority, might I add, an overwhelming majority of the data. So what about the story about John Knoll, an ILM guy, and Anakin's scar? He asked to George, so how did Anakin get that scar, George? George said, I don't know. Ask Howard, says George, referring to president of Lucas Licensing, Howard Rothman. That's one of those things that happens in the novels between the movies. I just put it there. He has to explain how it got there. I think Anakin got it slipping in the tub, but of course, he's not going to tell anybody that. I think this could be interpreted a few ways. If someone wanted to take this to mean George counted the EU, I could understand that. But just like the Splinter quote, it's not an end all be all. This is definitely one of the outliers. It's the exception, not the rule. My personal interpretation? George will never explain it, and he knows if anyone does, it would be Howard. This right here means George doesn't connect to the EU canon during the Clone Wars multimedia project that did explain it. It means that George is telling Howard, there you go, you can write a story about it. But on top of that, George says he thinks the answer is slipping in the bathtub, but he knows Howard won't tell that, so he's admitting Howard will tell a separate version of the story than what George counts. When asked in a 2012 Milken Institute interview how many characters of that Star Wars family exist today, George says, well, today there's over 5,000 characters. It's very big, we have lots of novels, lots of books, lots of games, and the movies and TV series. And there's a whole world of Star Wars now that didn't exist. I would say he's answering about Star Wars as an IP, not as personal canon. They initially were talking about character in the interview and how character drives the story prior to this question. If he went before that live audience and said Star Wars is just 6 movies and nothing else exists, he'd look like an idiot. Acknowledging it exists and that it's his own personal headcanon are two different things. And just for fun, notice he included TV series in that. Obviously, he's talking about TCW, seeing as this was a quote from 2012. Yet purists will still use this as a quote to say George is lumping his films with the EU, but exclude those same ramifications on TCW. In Star Wars Insider issue 45, George was asked, do you have a map of this universe, every single creature, where they come from, what they eat, what their society back home is like, or are you just making it up as you go? And George responded, well, I think somewhere in the dark recesses of my company's files there is something like that, but I've never seen it, and I don't really know. Even though I live this, and I know the worlds very well, and I know what everything in them is, half the time I'm just in the fortunate position to make it up. So when somebody asks me a question, I just know what the consistencies are. I know what is consistent with a particular environment and what isn't. And really, that's the job of the director, to keep everything in line. I can do that on the movie, but I can't do that in the Star Wars universe. I've seen some use this quote to suggest he is lumping the expanded lore of the EU in with the movies. Maybe? I don't see it that way. He's being asked if he could basically describe the makeup and function of everything in the Star Wars equivalent of the Milky Way galaxy. I see two possible interpretations aside from that. The one I'm going with is George is owning the films here, but it's very possible, as happens from time to time, that there could be an inconsistency in the EU regarding one of these issues he's asked about, and he doesn't want to own that because he had nothing to do with the other stuff. Star Wars by this point is an IP. And he's saying he doesn't know everything and anything about the IP, just his films. That doesn't mean he's lumping it all together. The other interpretation is he's merely talking about what's shown on screen for the movie, but he doesn't know the ins and outs of what has yet to be explored. For example, he knows the inner workings of the Tatooine planet, but what about the next planet over that never popped up on screen? Some might point to the history of George Lucas statements and claim the man changes his opinions and words all the time, something I don't necessarily buy into. On occasion, sure, but generally speaking, no. And so they'll say we can't trust his words and we can only look at his actions, to which they'll generally point to either his minimal involvement in the EU or his references to the EU in the prequel trilogy and original trilogy special editions. To that, I would simply turn around and point to his actions with the prequel trilogy EU retcons, TCW, and his treatments for the sequel trilogy. And if they want to go as far as to call that contradictory, even though I've explained why it's not, then I would say there's clearly no inconsistent answer that will appease them, and this debate is pointless because of that logic. George was asked once, do you supervise the development of all the off movie stories? After all, Star Wars exists in books, comics. He responded, I try not to think about that. I have my own world in movies and I follow it. Of course, that the people who expand this universe work for me, but I can't follow up all they produce. They'll mainly point to him saying people expand the universe for him as saying it's canon. I disagree. Once again, he's talking about Star Wars as an IP. The question literally states Star Wars is more than movies, it is also books and comics. He here distances himself and says, well, yeah, other people expand it for me, referring to the fact that other people do it and not him. If he just said, well, actually, that's not real Star Wars, he'd look like a jerk to the EU authors and fans, people who literally who he just said worked for him. And he'd look like an idiot too, on top of that. I don't see this quote as an issue. Other ones I've seen are there's two quotes from the New Yorker, John Seabrook. He is a journalist at the New Yorker. He's not a Lucasfilm official, but he spoke to a couple of the EU people, and he wrote some blurbs and quotes in his article. Some of these are direct quotes, and some of these are just his interpretation of the interview. Lucas's day-to-day activities in the main house include the management of the Star Wars story, which is probably the most carefully tended secular story on Earth. Unlike Star Trek, which is a series of episodes connected by no central narrative, Star Wars is a single story, a finite expanding universe, in the words of Tom Dupree, who edits Bantam's Star Wars novels in New York. Everyone in the content creating galaxy of Star Wars has a copy of the Bible, a burgeoning canonical document currently 170 pages long that is maintained by continuity editors Alan Kosh and Sue Rustoni. It is a chronology of all the events that have ever occurred in the Star Wars universe in all the films, books, CD-ROMs, Nintendo games, comic books, and role-playing guides, and each medium is seamlessly coordinated with the others. John Seabrook, again, he's an interviewer for a journalist paper, and he was interviewing Tom Dupree. None of the words about Lucas's day-to-day activities actually came from Tom Dupree. All Tom said was Star Wars is a single story, a finite expanding universe, and he talked to them about the Bible, the continuity Bible. Another one from John Seabrook. New developments in even the remotest corners of the Star Wars universe are always approved by Lucas himself. The continuity editors send him checklists of potential events, and Lucas checks yes or no. When Bantam wanted to do a backstory on Yoda, Dupree said, George said that was off limits because he wanted him to remain a mysterious character, but George is made available sometime between the start of Episode 4, wherein Han Solo is a young pilot on the planet Corellia, and the end of the prequel, so we're working with that now. We've talked about this quote before with the EU involvement. Again, Seabrook is a journalist and is using his own words to sum up Dupree's words. Dupree was talking about the checklist or basic ideas and events, and Seabrook interpreted that as Lucas approving everything. The quote itself that says new developments in even the remotest corners of the Star Wars universe are always approved by Lucas himself, that was not from Tom Dupree, that was from John Seabrook. That was his own interpretation. Again, he's a journalist, he doesn't work with Lucasfilm. Be assured that nothing Star Wars related that Dark Horse publishes escapes the scrutiny of Mr. Lucas. To that I would simply say, except Dark Empire, right? Odds are, again, he's either misinformed, or as we've demonstrated before, or this is a reference to the checklist concept. But what about all the other EU authors and officials that have said it was canon? Everything is official, canon, everything is canon, the novels, the comics, the video games. That was Leland Chee. First of all, when we were writing those books, we were told we were writing canon. So at that time, we were creating canon. Anybody who says they were never canon is just incorrect. That was Michael Stackpole. It was all canon. Everything published was canon. That's Matt Stover. I hope I did those impersonations properly. I've seen those clips so many times, but this might be a point where I can side with the EU purists a little bit. It absolutely was canon from 1990 or 1977 till 2014. As Michael Stackpole alluded to, it was all canon. As Howard Rothman said, there had to be continuity to everything. Tim Zahn couldn't write a story about Thrawn trilogy where Thrawn dies at the end of 9 ABY, and then someone else came along a few years later and wrote a different story about Thrawn 20 years after the Civil War ended. The authors had to work with each other. Sure, there were some retcons along the way, but that's natural. But there was an active effort to keep things in order. It wasn't a willful or intentional retcon. According to the, at least as far as I know, according to the official company Canon, the EU was canon until April 2014. However, canon refers to an authoritative list of books that the Lucas licensing editors consider an authentic part of the official Star Wars history. Our goal is to present a continuous and unified history of the Star Wars galaxy, insofar as that history does not conflict with or undermine the meaning of Mr. Lucas's Star Wars saga films and screenplays, things that Lucas licensing does not consider official part of the continuous Star Wars history shown in Infinite's logo or contained in Star Wars Tales. Everything else is considered canon. Sue Rustoni reused this quote and upheld its accuracy on StarWars.com in May 2003. Canon was a licensing term. I don't think Lucas even ever used the word canon once. So when the EU authors and Leland Shee, whom we've already talked about, talk about their works being canon, they are correct. They were canon per Lucas licensing, but that does not mean that they were canon per Lucas. Even Timothy Zahn, the chief EU contributing author, has pointed out that they always knew that it was subservient to George and that it wasn't the same type of canon. Some might challenge Tim's idea by saying other EU authors seemed to feel it was canon and George was involved. Unlike the other authors, as we've already discussed, Tim met George Lucas and they got to have a brief conversation. I think out of anyone, Tim was the EU author who was best able to speak regarding Lucas's thoughts on the EU, and he clearly had a different interpretation than some of the other authors like Stackpole. And even then, just because it was canon to licensing does not mean it was canon to Lucas. Some again may be screaming at me through their monitors about how Lucas owned licensing, so my distinction is irrelevant. Yet, I disagree. I've seen this quote used to suggest Lucas really did have a hand in the EU canon thing. I pulled this screenshot from a video, and I don't know its original source, but I do believe it's authentic. Let's read it. The gatekeeper. So who is the guardian of our intergalactic pearly gates? Our St. Peter is Lucasfilm licensing vice president Howard Rothman. Several years ago, we made the decision with George to open up the Star Wars universe beyond the scope of the first trilogy and independent of whatever the next trilogy would hold, said Rothman. George provided us with some general guidelines about what we could and couldn't do. For instance, we couldn't do stories in the time period a couple of generations before Star Wars because that's when he planned to focus the next trilogy. However, we could extend the fantasy after Return of the Jedi. Lucasfilm licensing serves two functions. They make sure all new material is consistent with the films, consistent in its portrayal of the Rebels and the Empire's conflict, consistent in how it introduces characters of different races and cultures, and even consistent in design direction. Additionally, Lucas licensing makes sure the new material from different sources is consistent. Our aim is to have a lot of cross-fertilization between mediums. This validates the universe for fans, continued Rothman. We're building an integrated team that's producing product in this integrated universe. The result is a universe so carefully and explicitly evolved that it begins to parallel our own Milky Way in its diversity, logic, and believability. Sure, it says here Howard and George made the decision to open up the universe for storytelling. His use of the words independent of whatever the next trilogy would hold is interesting. Either way, this quote is used to try to say Lucas was part of making the EU canon. Is that true, though? As we already talked about, Howard revealed the details of that decision in 2017, and he explicitly said that the only way George allowed this to happen was that the EU was a separate story, like how Star Trek runs their publishing. And we know this is true because Lucas has made references to the Star Trek situation at least twice, once in 2005 and once in 2008. So this very decision George was a part of, that purists try to say means George saw the EU as canon, in actuality means the complete opposite. George only agreed with this decision because the EU was not canon to his films. This leads right into an interesting one I've seen thrown around, specifically by the EU purist channel Star Wars Scran, who, make no mistake, I have no personal beef with him, and I think he's a decent guy, but this line of defense needs to be addressed. In regards to Disney Lucasfilm relegating the expanded universe to the Legends continuity, he has said that canon is established, not dictated. His live stream titled Decanonized from April 25th, 2025, around the 12-minute mark starts talking about the Bible, and he uses that as an example. I'm not sure if Star Wars Scran is religious or not, and how much he knows about the Bible, but as a Latter day Saint, canon is something I've done a deep dive into, as our faith's stance on canon is a major controversy between us and other Christian faiths. And let me tell you, saying canon is established, not dictated, is not applicable to the Bible and Christianity. For example, the LDS Church's canon is open and new revelations can overwrite pre existing ones. We see some of this in the Bible, especially when newer prophets and apostles, etc., reinterpret the meaning of prior prophets' words. For example, a lot of prophecies about Christ in the Old Testament were initially not attributed to messianic prophecies by Jews. Even in Catholicism, the Pope has made changes to the Church's canon law. Also, as time goes on, with the more we learn about biblical history, culture, and manuscripts, the more our understanding of the text may change and impact the meaning of the scripture, which essentially changes canon readings of it. Originally, Christianity was one faith and eventually split up. Protestantism came from Catholicism, and the Protestant Bible actually has less books than the Catholic Bible. The Protestants determined they were not going to count them as canon. Even Eastern Orthodox has more of the books of the Bible than Catholics. And Latter day Saints would actually say we don't count the Song of Solomon from the Bible as canon, even though it was considered canon for centuries. Even going back to the ancient church councils where the Christian Bible was formed, there were tons of texts that at least some Christians counted as canonical that were not included in the Bible of Scripture going forward. Even if you're going to count those as just denominational struggles and differences on what God actually counted as canon all along, take a look at the Book of Enoch. It was at one point considered canon. It was found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the Epistle of Jude in the New Testament even quotes it. But within the first couple centuries after Christ, the book lost its canonicity status. Even though it was lost for a while and has since been recovered from the Qumran caves, it has not been added back into the canon. But let's say he's merely talking about Star Wars, and the Bible was just a poor analogy on his part. Let's dive in and see if that's really true. Let's look at the Marvel comics from the 70s. Initially, they were considered canon. An interview between Echo Station's Jim Morrow and Archie Goodwin in 2001. In the beginning, I would send a synopsis of the storyline I was planning to do to Lucasfilm, and the folks in their licensing department would check over what I was doing. I dealt with a lady named Carol Titleman, practically a one-person licensing department for Lucasfilm. Later on, as they hired more people, there would be an editor that I worked with and submitted material to. They got to where they could trust me enough that I could generally get the comic book done and submit the finished version for them to check over. After a year or so, they became comfortable with me. Occasionally, I would do a story that they would feel uncomfortable with, and I might have to make changes. When asked, I'm curious as to what limitations Lucasfilm set on your storylines. Were there any story ideas you wanted to explore but were not allowed to? Archie replied, not really. But as time went on, the Marvel comics lost their canonicity status. Lucasfilm's stance on Marvel, as I've learned in the time I've spent writing for WEG, Topps, and soon Dark Horse, more on that at a later date, is that they don't have a problem with fitting the Marvel tales into current continuity so long as it's not done in your face. In other words, the writers were allowed to consider the Marvel series as part of the continuity, but more of a background continuity than a foreground continuity. I know that sounds a little screwy, and I can foresee some eyebrows raising over this post, but that's not how the Marvel series currently stands. That was Rich Hanley, an EU author, in 1999. The premise of all the comic books and novels, games, and other spin-off works is that they all work chronologically, that the movie continuity forms one unbroken story. Since our movies have their own internal continuity, we maintain that in the spin-off works. Technically, George Lucas has been doing continuity all along by mapping out the 9 films, but it wasn't until 1991 when Timothy Zahn wrote the novel Heir to the Empire, the first Star Wars bestseller, which was the beginning of what we call the Star Wars Renaissance, that continuity became an issue. The expanded universe was left to Marvel Comics, which produced characters that would sometimes irk Lucasfilm, the most infamous being one of the earliest, a wisecracking green cartoon rabbit called Jackson, modeled on Bugs Bunny. Jackson offered the first inkling of the disastrously off-base concepts and creations that could swirl out of the expanded universe. But for every Jackson, fortunately, there was a Mara Jade or a Grand Admiral Thrawn. I had a conversation with the YouTuber Star Wars Grand who suggested everything prior to Heir to the Empire, including Splinter the Mind's Eye, was not initially canon and it only became canon later on when the 90s era continuity writers included them. Here's an image from an early Marvel comic book. I don't know which one, but the text implies it is pre Empire Strikes Back, and it further demonstrates that they were intended to be canon. We're going to read the second side of the first image onwards, as that's what's relevant. Accordingly, Ray got together for lunch in Hollywood the other day with George Lucas as well as amiable Mark Hamill, who plays Lucas in the movie, to discuss the direction he and Hallie would take the strip. Measers, Thomas, and Chaskin had already plotted number 7, and set the direction for an issue or two beyond, but they wanted to be sure that their own scheme of things did not conflict with future plans of George himself, who oversees the movies, books, and other priceless items which will be emanating from the Star Wars Corporation in the months to come. Fortunately for all of us, or for us all, since we already later in the shadow of the dreaded deadline doom, George was enthusiastic about what Roy and Howie have done, and the other directions he suggested for the strip were nearly identical to what our writer-artist team wanted to do anyway, which perhaps is only natural since Roy and Howie have been two of the movie's biggest boosters since long before the film was even completed, let alone released. Thus, beginning next issue, you'll be treated to the first ever sequel to Star Wars, the film, and Star Wars, the comic mag, in a series of stories which initially will center mostly around the space mercenary Han Solo and his Wookiee companion Chewbacca, but never fear, because Mark Hamill threatened to turn the Sand People of Tatooine loose on RT and HC if they don't bring Luke and company into the scene pretty soon as well. Oh yes, and one final point. Roy was pleased as a parsec of Punch to learn that he is one of the few people in this galaxy who is spelling the word Wookiee correctly, namely with 2 E's. Most places, even in the movie's own program books, it's been misspelled with only 1, and since George went to great pains to explain just how upset Wookiees get when their generic name is mishandled, we're glad it wasn't us who goofed. Now on to a few letters about our second Smash issue. Okay, so then there we go. It was from the second issue. The other quote, far from simply batting out the Star Wars comic as you suggest, Roy spent, as did Howie, long hours for no pay at the Lucasfilm offices on the Universal movie lot, talking with writer-director Lucas and with media projects director Charles Lippincott about the way the series should be handled. He spent more hours with them, as well as the movie stars Mark Hamill and Harrison Ford, since then getting all the feedback he can on how things should go in future stories. Since both movie and paperback sequels are projected and George naturally wishes to keep them all consistent, this is a far more complicated project even than writing and editing books like Conan or Tarzan, let alone other comic mags. These images describe George's involvement and oversight in a similar manner to the EU stories of the 90s, and the quotes we went over from Archie Goodwin earlier showed, again, a similar process. So I don't really know what makes the EU purists think this wasn't originally meant to be canon. The only reason they have to do so is the word of a 90s era EU overseers. Similar to how Disney Lucasfilm overseers say the previous EU is not canon, even though Lucasfilm officials previously said it was. See, like history's almost repeating itself. On top of that, here's the complete forward from Splinter of the Mind's Eye, republished 1996 copy, where George makes it pretty clear that it was meant to be part of the expanded universe. We're just going to read the second paragraph onwards as that's what's relevant. After Star Wars was released, it became apparent that my story, however many films it took to tell, was only one of thousands that could be told about the characters who inhabit its galaxy. These were not stories that I was destined to tell. Instead, they would spring from the imagination of other writers inspired by the glimpse of a galaxy that Star Wars provided. Today, it is an amazing, if unexpected, legacy of Star Wars that so many gifted writers are contributing new stories to the saga. This legacy began with Splinter of the Mind's Eye, published less than a year after the release of Star Wars, written by Alan Dean Foster, a well-known and talented science fiction author. Splinter was promoted as a further adventure of Luke Skywalker. It hit the bookstores just as I was preparing to write my own further adventure of Luke, in the form of a script entitled The Empire Strikes Back. It seems only fitting after all these years that Splinter would be republished as I prepare once again to write another further adventure set a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. This seems to heavily imply Splinter was always meant to be part of the canon. If Lucas really thought this was a discarded, no longer needed story since Empire was coming out, he would have had it thrown out. Yet it was published the year after Star Wars came out, even though Lucas knew A New Hope was a hit and was further moving along with The Empire Strikes Back. And again, too, they'll use the 90s words, continuity editors, to be like, well, we'll see, they're saying Marvel comics weren't meant to be canon. But again, here we have Lucas talking about how Splinter was meant to be canon. The 90s continuity editors were saying continuity only became a thing after Heir to the Empire. So by that quote, you have to remove Splinter from being initially considered canon, even though that's not what Lucas thought. So again, the early Marvel comics and Splinter the Mind's Eye, along with the Han and Lando novels, were clearly intended to be canon early on. They then lost their canonicity status, at least the Marvel comics did. Later on, they were allowed to be re-entered into the canon if referenced by C-canon, which changed their canon tiers. Leland Chi said regarding the Marvel comics, S-canon with stuff that has been referenced as C-canon. When asked at Comic-Con in 2011 whether the comics were counted as canon, he said, well, you got some things like Marvel comics for a period were sort of being disregarded for a long period of time, and we eventually brought that back. This sounds very much like canon being dictated as opposed to being established. And even if Star Wars Scran is right, and they were originally not considered to be anything other than fan fiction, and they weren't considered canon, making them canon in the 90s is dictating canon. Making something non-canon into canon is essentially the same as taking something canon and making it non-canon. The approach to Marvel Comics in the 90s and early 2000s seems to be a case of treat it as non-canon and you could cherry pick and take what you like and bring it into the canon. That sounds like the exact same thing Lucasfilm is doing with the original EU now, but purists will criticize them for doing that, even though their own continuity they love so much did that exact same thing with the continuity that came before. And it wasn't just the Marvel comics. This is from Sue Restoni in 2003. Canon, confusing sometimes. Basically, everything except those items marked with an infinity logo is considered canon. There is a hierarchy. The movies, novelizations, radio dramas come first, then everything else. If something in a novelization contradicts the movies, then we defer to the movies, i.e., the Return of the Jedi novelization says that Obi-Wan and Owen Lars were brothers. This wasn't in the movie and has since been discounted. Maybe it was a cover they used at one point. Who knows? The one area that's constantly in dispute are the Marvel comics and David's middle grade books, The Glove of Vader, etc. For these, if something adds to the universe and does not contradict either already established facts or Star Wars sensibility, we accept it and add it to the lore. If it does, we disregard it. At the time these products were published, the idea of continuous history hadn't been established. I hope this helps. Sue. In real life, the children's series of which you write was conceived and published before the official continuity policy was established. So the major events like Han and Leia's wedding are discounted. We've been able to logically and realistically incorporate some of the elements in the books into the established continuity, as Tasty pointed out. But at the time they were written, we had no idea whether people would even want to read Star Wars books, and there was that chance that if the Zahn trilogy didn't do well, the whole program would have never happened. Even when dealing with retcons, the canonicity of an item is called into question. Wizards, let's say that you come across two or more contradictory sources while chasing down a reference. How do you decide which one to accept as canon? Leland Chi said everything is looked at a case-by-case basis. Among the factors we consider, in how many sources does this particular fact happen? Which source has the largest audience? Which explanation is the coolest? Have we been told by George Lucas to avoid this topic? If after weighing all those variables the answer isn't yet clear, the issue is presented to an internal group that makes the final determination as to which source is correct. So here you have it. Leland Chi says that there's two contradictory sources they can't reconcile. They basically decide, even though both of those works were intended to be canon, they get to decide which one's actually canon or not. Canon gets played with all the time. When the Thrawn trilogy first came out, it was considered canon, as the purists like to remind people. Everything it laid out about the Clone Wars, including the timetable of the conflict, was canon 100%, and we showed this with reference guides from 1994 earlier in the video. Then the prequel trilogy came out, and obviously the two sources contradict. So the Thrawn trilogy either has to lose its canonicity status, or you have to say, well, actually it's mostly canon, but that one part isn't, which is the case of dictating canon. Owen's brother is also an instance of dictating canon. Initially, it was Owen being his brother, but after Attack of the Clones, a new brother for Kenobi was made named Owen, and it had to be retconned that all references to Owen Lars being his brother actually meant another Owen, even though those instances that did so were quite clearly Owen Lars. This is dictating canon by changing the meaning of the text or the acceptability or the reliability of the text. Even for all the retcons created by the prequel trilogy, even if later sources fixed them, you could still only fix them in most cases by reducing the canonicity status of a portion of the source. If I take the plain text of the Tales from the Bounty Hunter And Dark Empire 2 about Boba Fett and compare it with Attack of the Clones, regardless of future stories, those two texts are not reconcilable. So you have to play with it a little bit to resolve it. Even saying the Marvel comics are S canon and not really counted unless a C canon source brings it up, then it becomes canon, is essentially dictating the canon. It is inconsistent for an EU purist to claim that canon is only established, not dictated. It is done because they don't want to admit that the company that put all the EU material out to begin with, Lucasfilm, has now actually decanonized the work that they enjoy. Even if they try to put forth the idea that George, as creator, is the only one who has the right to determine canon status, something I believe he lost when he sold that right to Disney, he has clearly established his canon is not the EU. And to that, I would also say, what happened if George, heaven forbid, died halfway through the creation of a novel series? Would that forever be incomplete? Would Star Wars stop if he died? If he was halfway through making his live action series and he passed away, would that forever be incomplete? Furthermore, as we established, there are several EU stories Lucas had nothing to do with. They seem to mostly be minor ones, but it wasn't even an approval or veto power or anything. Should those be considered canon to the EU even though he didn't touch it? So if EU purists are going to ignore George on the matter and stick with Lucasfilm, well, Lucasfilm made the decision to change the canon status on the EU material. Sure, the chief at the very top may be different, but other personnel were still around, like Howard Rothman, who was still with the company until retiring a few years after the acquisition. Some suggest that because George Lucas has read the comics and likes them, that means they're canon to him. First off, not so fast. Keep in mind that Lucas has gone on record saying that he doesn't read that stuff. It's the words of other people that say he reads them. The only thing George has explicitly said about the comics was in regards to Ayla Secura, whom he described seeing on the cover of a comic, not actually reading the comic itself. I do think Lucas probably reads some of the comics, though, but either way, that doesn't mean he counts them as canon. It's possible he read some of the Infinites comics. Would that make them canon? Same with the Star Wars parodies. Some might even point out he collected some of the EU cover art, but that doesn't mean anything because, according to artist Simeon Bianchi, Lucasfilm purchased one of the originals of the artwork for his Star Wars #7 from the 2015 Marvel comic run specifically for Lucas because he loved it so much. Does that make that comic canon? George Lucas said he liked the Kenobi series. And this doesn't seem to be Lucasfilm lying. They have been open and honest about George's displeasure with 7, with Bob Iger still defending their decisions in his 2019 memoir, and they haven't even talked about Lucas's thoughts on the project since 2018 Solo. Does him liking Kenobi make it canon? George liking some of the EU has no bearing on him counting it as canon.
Thanks for watching. Please subscribe to the channel. If you liked the video, comment down below and hit that like button. Oh, and check out some of my other videos. I'm sure you'll find them in the light.